Let me tell you something that happened this morning that I think most people are going to completely misunderstand. And I want to be honest with you right up front. This is not a complicated story. It is actually a very simple story. But simple stories are often the ones that change everything. Yesterday, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz completely open. Trump posted "thank you" in capital letters. Stock markets surged. Oil prices dropped. Every major news channel ran a version of the same headline: "Deal close, war ending, Hormuz open." It looked like America had won something. This morning, Iran closed it again. The IRGC announced that control of the Strait of Hormuz has returned to its previous state. Strict management, armed forces in control, ships turning around in the Persian Gulf, tankers going dark. 5 Greek and Indian vessels made their way toward the strait and U-turned before they got there. One tanker stopped transmitting its location entirely. And the IRGC used a word that I want you to hold on to. They did not call America's blockade a military action. They did not call it economic pressure. They called it piracy. Piracy and maritime robbery. Those are their exact words. And here's the thing I want you to understand. I said this was coming. Not yesterday, not last week. I have been saying this since before this war started, because the structure of this situation makes it completely predictable. And the reason it is predictable has nothing to do with Iran's military power. It has everything to do with what China built over the last 10 years. So today, I want to do 2 things. First, I want to explain exactly why I said Iran would never give up Hormuz on America's terms, and use game theory and structural history to show you why that prediction was the only logical conclusion. And second, now that Iran has proved it in 24 hours, I want to tell you what happens next. Because this morning's events are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new phase that almost nobody is analyzing correctly. Let us begin. Let me start with the prediction, because I think it is important to explain not just what I predicted, but how I predicted it. Because predictive history is not guessing. It is not opinion. It is a method. And if you understand the method, you can see exactly what comes next. The method starts with one question. What does each player actually want? Not what they say they want. What they actually want. Because in game theory, those 2 things are almost always different. What does America say it wants? America says it wants the Strait of Hormuz open. It wants Iran to give up its nuclear program. It wants a deal. It wants the war to end. That is what America says. What does America actually want? America wants to demonstrate that it can control the world's most important energy choke point, that it can force a regional power to submit, that the threat of American military force is still the most powerful instrument in global politics. America needs to prove this not just to Iran, but to China, to Russia, to every country watching this war decide whether American power still means what it used to mean. Now, what does Iran say it wants? Iran says it wants the blockade lifted. It wants its frozen assets unfrozen. It wants Lebanon included in any ceasefire. It wants its sovereignty recognized. What does Iran actually want? Iran wants something much deeper than any of that. Iran wants to establish permanently, irreversibly, that the Strait of Hormuz is under Iranian sovereign control, not just during this war, forever, as a structural feature of the global energy system. Iran wants every country that imports oil through Hormuz to know that Iranian permission is required. Because if that becomes the established reality, Iran has transformed itself from a sanctioned pariah into an indispensable strategic actor. And no amount of bombing can undo that transformation once it is established in practice. These 2 things, what America wants and what Iran wants, are completely incompatible. America cannot demonstrate control of Hormuz while Iran is exercising sovereign authority over it. Iran cannot establish permanent sovereign authority over Hormuz while America's blockade declares it illegal. There is no compromise position. There is no face-saving middle ground. One of them wins this argument or neither does. That is why I said months ago that Iran would never give up Hormuz on America's terms. Not because Iran is irrational, not because Iran wants war, but because giving up Hormuz on America's terms would mean giving up the one leverage point that makes Iran strategically relevant. And no state voluntarily gives up the thing that makes it relevant. This is game theory, simple game theory, and yet Washington kept acting as though maximum pressure would force Iran to fold, as though bombing alone could change Iran's strategic calculation, as though a country fighting for its permanent strategic relevance would back down because of a blockade. It did not fold, and this morning it proved it. But here is the part of this story that nobody in mainstream coverage is connecting properly. The part that explains not just why Iran refused to fold, but why Iran was able to refuse. Because here is the question that needs answering. Iran has been bombed for 50 days. Its supreme leader was killed on the first day of the war. 13 of its US bases are partially or heavily paralyzed. Its central bank warned internally that recovery could take 12 years. Its economy is under the most intensive American pressure it has ever faced. And yet this morning, Iran closed Hormuz again with confidence, without flinching, calling America a pirate. How does a country in that position, a country that has absorbed 50 days of the most intensive American bombing campaign since the Gulf War, how does that country close Hormuz again and call America a pirate? What is the structural foundation of that confidence? One word: China. And I do not mean China in the news headline sense. I do not mean China as a diplomatic ally or a political partner. I mean China as an economic architecture, a decade-long infrastructure that China built specifically so that if this moment ever came, if America ever tried to use a blockade to economically collapse Iran, Iran would not collapse. Let me walk you through what that architecture looks like, because this is the framework I want to give you today. I call it the decade of quiet. And once you understand it, you will never again be surprised by anything Iran does in this conflict. The decade of quiet starts in 2018. That is when Trump pulled the United States out of the 2015 nuclear deal and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. At that moment, China made a decision. A quiet decision, a decision that nobody in Washington was paying serious attention to at the time. China decided it would become Iran's economic lifeline, not because China loves Iran, not because China and Iran share deep values or a civilizational bond. China made this decision for one purely strategic reason. China imports approximately 1/3 of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China's entire industrial economy runs on energy that passes through a narrow 33-kilometer corridor that America has historically controlled. China calculated, correctly as it turns out, that if America ever managed to fully weaponize that control, China would be in serious trouble. So China built a parallel system, quietly, over a decade. The first layer of that system is the payment architecture. China began buying Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. This bypassed the SWIFT financial network entirely. SWIFT is the global messaging system that connects banks and enables dollar-denominated international payments. American sanctions work by cutting countries out of SWIFT. If you cannot receive dollars, you cannot pay for imports. You cannot fund your military. You cannot function in the modern economy. China's yuan payment system for Iranian oil bypasses all of that. Iran gets paid. The money does not touch the dollar system. America cannot touch it. The second layer is the dark fleet. China's tanker network, what intelligence analysts call the shadow fleet, spent a decade perfecting techniques for moving Iranian oil invisibly. Ships that turn off their automatic identification system transponders, going dark on satellite tracking. Ships that fly the flags of random countries, sometimes landlocked countries, to disguise their origin and ownership. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters near Malaysia, where Iranian crude is mixed with other oil, relabeled as Malaysian crude, and delivered to Chinese refineries called teapots that process sanctioned oil without documentation. China's own customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022. Yet, China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude reached 1.3 million barrels per day last year, more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. That oil was Iranian. The paperwork said Malaysian. The system worked. The third layer is strategic reserves. China entered this war sitting on approximately 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil in strategic storage, built over 2 years by quietly purchasing Iranian and Russian oil at heavily discounted prices. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and global oil prices spiked above $120 per barrel, China did not panic. Its markets stayed stable, its refineries kept running, its economy kept going. While Europe was scrambling and the International Energy Agency was warning about jet fuel shortages, China had 4 months of supply cover sitting in warehouses. The energy shock that America designed to force Iran to its knees did not reach China. China had prepared for it. And then the fourth layer, the one that most people are still not fully reporting on, China's satellites. The T-01B satellite, built by Chinese company EarthEye, launched from Chinese soil, secretly acquired by the IRGC in late 2024. Resolution of 0.5 meters per pixel, 10 times sharper than Iran's own best satellite, monitoring Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, monitoring the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, monitoring American positions across the region, feeding targeting data in real time to Iranian strike systems, connected with Russian satellite intelligence, creating a 500 to 1,000 mile zone around Iran where, as one American military analyst put it, if you can be seen, you can be targeted. And America cannot destroy those satellites without starting a direct war with China. This is the decade of quiet. 10 years of patient, invisible, deliberate construction, payment systems, dark fleets, strategic reserves, satellite networks. China never announced any of it. China never signed a treaty with Iran about it. China simply built it, quietly, rung by rung, layer by layer. And this morning, when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again and called America a pirate, Iran did it from the structural foundation that China spent a decade building. Now, I want to steelman the American position, because I never want you to just accept what I say. I want you to test the argument. The American argument is this: maximum pressure works. The blockade is squeezing Iran. Iran's economy is in serious trouble. The central bank's own internal assessment says 12 years to recovery. The rial has lost 15% of its value in a month. Iran fired fewer missiles in the last week of the war than the first. The pressure is building. The blockade will force Iran to a deal. And there is more. America has turned back over 10 ships at the blockade. It has expanded boarding authority to cover the entire Arabian Sea. It has imposed new sanctions on Iranian oil shipping networks. It is rearming. Hegseth confirmed at the Pentagon that America is reloading with more power than it had at the start of the war. America is not standing still. It is applying pressure on every front simultaneously. The military pressure, the financial pressure, the diplomatic pressure through Pakistan and Turkey and Egypt. All of it is real. All of it is sustained. And America's argument is that eventually, before Tuesday, when the ceasefire expires, the accumulated weight of all that pressure will break Iran's resistance. This argument is not wrong about the numbers. Iran is under genuine economic stress. The damage is real. The blockade is creating real pain. Trump offered Iran $20 billion in frozen assets. The negotiations on that number were real. Iran was discussing terms. Movement was happening. The argument that pressure produces results is not an empty argument. It has historical precedent. Libya, 2003. South Africa in the 1980s. The pressure argument sometimes works, but here is what the American argument misses. And this is the core of the analytical framework I want to give you today. The argument confuses pain with collapse. These are not the same thing. Pain means a country is suffering. Collapse means a country cannot function. The distance between those two things is exactly what China's decade of quiet was designed to create. China's payment systems, dark fleet, and strategic reserves did not prevent the pain. Iran is in pain, but they prevented the collapse. Iran still has oil revenue flowing, not at pre-war levels, but enough. Iran still has the structural support to keep making choices rather than being forced to make them. Iran still has enough economic oxygen to decide when to open Hormuz, when to close it, when to negotiate, and when to walk away. That is the difference. Trump spent 50 days trying to force Iran to a decision. Iran is making its own decisions. The distance between those two things is China. Now let me tell you what I think happens next, because this morning is not a random event. It is a signal, and I want to read that signal carefully using the same framework: game theory, structural history, real incentives. There are three structural possibilities from this point. The first possibility is that the economic pressure finally crosses the threshold, and Iran accepts a deal before the ceasefire expires on Tuesday. Under this scenario, Iran calculates that the cost of continuing is now higher than the cost of conceding. The $20 billion in frozen assets that America is reportedly offering becomes decisive. Iran demanded $27 billion. America started at $6 billion. The meeting point was $20 billion. Iran accepts a framework. The deal happens. Both sides declare victory. Trump says he won. Iran says it defended its sovereignty. And quietly, in the details of any agreement, Iran keeps some form of coordinated access over Hormuz. Not legal sovereignty, but practical authority. Ships must coordinate with Iranian forces. Ships must follow Iranian designated routes. The IRGC remains present in the strait. Iran calls it managed navigation. America calls it freedom of navigation. Both are telling different versions of the same reality. This is the Libya path. A country accepts terms that look like surrender, but actually preserve its core strategic position. The difference is that Libya gave up everything and got nothing. Iran, with China's support, has the leverage to give up the optics and keep the substance. This possibility is real. It is what the Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi diplomatic framework is working toward. The second possibility is that the talks fail again. The ceasefire expires on Tuesday with no deal. America faces the decision it has been avoiding: escalate further or find a face-saving exit. Escalating means the bombing resumes. And here is what makes the second round structurally different from the first. Iran's missile cities, the underground bunker networks in the mountains that American bombing tried to seal by collapsing tunnel entrances, have been actively clearing debris during the ceasefire. Satellite images from Khomeini base showed front-end loaders and dump trucks operating around the clock during the pause in fighting. Half of Iran's missile launchers remain intact, buried but not destroyed. China supplied tunnel boring machines specifically designed to help Iran dig out those blocked tunnels. Russia supplied humanitarian aid that included technologies essential for integrated air defense. Iran used the ceasefire exactly the way one American analyst predicted. It ate the first attack, dug itself out, and is now ready to launch again. The IRGC Aerospace Force commander said publicly that its finger is on the trigger and it is in full readiness. If talks fail and bombing resumes, America may discover that the second phase of this war is significantly more expensive than the first. The third possibility, and this is the one I think China is actively working toward, is an extended ceasefire that gradually becomes a permanent reality without ever being called a formal deal. China has been in daily diplomatic contact with both sides throughout this entire conflict. Wang Yi called Araghchi directly and pressed for the Hormuz opening, the call that produced Iran's announcement. China has been coordinating with Russia. Lavrov flew to Beijing, met Xi. They confirmed their relationship was unshakable amid any storms. China and Pakistan delivered a 5-point peace initiative together. China's strategic interest is not in either side winning decisively. China's interest is in a stable Hormuz, a surviving Iran, and a demonstrated precedent, visible to every country in the world, that American blockades cannot function without Chinese cooperation to end them. If China can produce an indefinite ceasefire that nobody formally calls a peace treaty, that serves China better than any other outcome. Iran survives, Hormuz reopens, China's oil flows, and the permanent historical record shows that the world's most important maritime choke point was resolved when China's foreign minister made a phone call, not when America imposed a blockade. Watch what China does not say in the next 72 hours. Because in this story, as I have said before, silence is the signal. China's silence after major Iranian moves has consistently been the loudest diplomatic communication in this conflict. Let me bring this all together. I said Iran would never give up Hormuz on America's terms. I said it because the game theory made it the only logical conclusion. A country does not voluntarily give up the one thing that makes it strategically relevant, and Iran's structural ability to refuse was not Iranian stubbornness. It was Chinese infrastructure. China spent a decade building the architecture that gave Iran the economic oxygen to make its own choices under maximum American pressure. Payment systems outside the dollar, a shadow fleet that moved oil invisibly while official records showed zero, strategic reserves that absorbed the energy shock, satellite networks that guided Iranian strikes onto American targets, tunnel boring machines shipped to help Iran rebuild its missile cities during the ceasefire, cargo aircraft landing in Tehran with weapons valued at billions, while Trump wrote a polite letter to Xi, and Xi wrote back saying essentially he was not doing that. This morning, Iran closed Hormuz again. In 24 hours, it proved everything I said about the structural foundations of this conflict. Not because Iran is stronger than America. Iran is not stronger than America in any conventional military sense, but because China spent a decade making sure that American strength, however overwhelming, could not translate into the specific outcome America was trying to force. The ceasefire expires in 3 days. The second round of talks has no confirmed date. Iran's parliament speaker says the rules of Hormuz will be determined on the battlefield. Trump says Iran has agreed to everything. Iran says Trump's claims are false. Ships are turning around in the Persian Gulf. And somewhere in Beijing, in a briefing room full of people who spent years designing exactly this outcome, nobody is surprised by any of it. That is what happens when one side plays the long game and the other side plays Twitter. This is not prophecy. This is game theory and structural history. The decade of quiet produced exactly what it was designed to produce. And the next phase of this story will be determined by whether America finally treats this as a US-Iran-China problem, or continues trying to solve a three-player game while pretending one of the players is not at the table. Push back on this if you see it differently. Read the IRGC statement from this morning. Read the Irish Times report on ships turning around. Read the Axios scoop on the 20 billion uranium negotiation. Read what Galibaf said about the battlefield determining Hormuz's future. And then ask yourself the question I keep asking. If China spent a decade making sure Iran never had to give up Hormuz on America's terms, what else has China already built for the next crisis that America has not yet seen coming? Because the decade of quiet did not end with this war. It is still running. And whatever China is building right now, quietly, in the next decade, will determine the next moment exactly like this one.